The much anticipated flashback episode that has been hyped up by both the Murder Drones fanbase and N's voice actor has been released, and I think everyone can agree that in typical Murder Drones fashion it is not what anyone expected it to be. I'm going to go over a brief summary of what happened in this episode, so if you want to get right to the review, skip to the time displayed on screen. The episode opens with a tape dubbed zombie drones being played on a TV in the middle of a junkyard filled with the corpses of worker drones. The camera cuts to a once dead worker drone rebooting underneath an excessive pile of worker drone corpses, and the camera cuts to a manor where N when he was a worker drone reading a book about dogs. A hatch on the floor next to him begins to pound with something trying to get out and get to him, and he does one of the most irrational things imaginable and just walks away. He meets up with Sin, who wants to go to the gala with N, but N says they can't because Tessa's family does not want them there. Sin continues to push N until he compromises and says that they can ask Tessa and see if she's fine with it. Tessa is inside the gala with Jay trying to figure out how to act around humans since they are having company over. When Tessa spots N, she quickly grabs him, overjoyed to see him, but when she sees Sin, she feels just the opposite. N notices in a window a message saying that when he's about to die, say the name Dark X Wolf 17. Tessa's mother, who I guess is named Louisa, intervenes, upset with Tessa for bringing N, Jay, and Sin in, despite there being other worker drones already setting up for a party. Louisa orders Tessa to throw Sin in the swamp, and mentions that tomorrow N and Jay will be thrown away as well. As she begins to walk away, Sin tells Louisa that they can't be thrown out. Louisa becomes infuriated, but N takes the blame, telling her that he told Sin to say that and insults Louisa. We next see N chained to a tree in the aforementioned swamp and being attacked by crows. He says X Dark Wolf 17 and the crows fly away with a single crow standing alone with his eyes burned out and replaced with the Absolute Solver symbol. Uzi's voice comes from the crow and explains to N that he's currently reliving his memories because the Absolute Solver program within N is trying to delete them, and Uzi has hacked into him to try to stop it. N and Crow Uzi go back to the manor and find that they need to get into the hatch from the beginning of the episode, but find that a dysfunctional V is standing on top of it. They move V aside, but the latch requires a key to open, and notice that V is starting to turn back on, and they quickly escape. Meanwhile, Tessa, Jay, and Sin are all chained up in Tessa's room. Tessa asks Jay to help them escape, but Jay declines due to that order conflicting with the one corporate gave her, and Sin easily escapes and transforms into the centipede-like creature we saw back in episode 2, and warns Tessa to stay away from the gala. After Sin leaves, Tessa takes advantage of Jay's loyalty to the company, and says that the Chains want paid time off to attend union negotiations, sending Jay into a murderous frenzy and breaking their chains. They sneak their way to the gala and find a sword and a revolver to use to stop Sin. They then run into N and Crow Uzi, and Tessa tells N that Sin is going to massacre the gala, while Uzi takes the basement key from Jay. A possessed V drops down from the ceiling and begins to attack N, but Jay fends them off and tells them to get to the basement. N and Crow Uzi get to the hatch, but when they open it, the Absolute Solver emerges and kills Crow Uzi and begins to drag N into the basement, but Uzi hacks it and takes control. The two enter the basement and find dismembered versions of N, J, and V being converted into disassembly drones. Uzi is about to get them out of N's memories, but is interrupted when Khan enters her room, asking if Doll was invited as Doll barges in, and begins to take the robo-bug that Uzi found in the last episode. Back in N's memories, Sin takes back control of the Absolute Solver and straps him to a chair, preparing to delete his memories once and for all. Meanwhile, at the gala, Sin in her worker drone form interrupts the party, and Tessa tries to stop her by shooting at her and throwing everything she can at her, but since Sin has the Absolute Solver's telekinetic powers, nothing affects her, and she transforms into her Absolute Solver form, telling Tessa that she didn't have to see this. We cut back to the basement as we hear the screams of the massacre taking place, and the Absolute Solver in its current form is having trouble picking up the tools necessary to delete N's memories. The Absolute Solver lets V in to help her, but since V has oversized claws, she cannot pick up the tools either. The Absolute Solver loses his patience and is about to attack V, but N puts V's glasses on her so that she can see, and she is elegantly able to pick up the tools without a problem. N's kindness snaps V out of her possessed state, and before she has the time to react, is pinned by the Absolute Solver, and it decides just to brute force the operation, deleting his entire operating system instead of just his memories. Back in Uzi's room, she is caught in a standstill between her and Doll fighting over the robo-bug when Uzi notices that N and V are beginning to short circuit without her help and relinquishes the bug to Doll so that she can save them. Uzi hacks in just in time to stop the Absolute Solver and pulls N and V out of their memories. Doll teleports to a frozen lake right outside the camp from the last episode and gives the bug to Tessa and Jay in trade for bringing her along with them. Tessa turns around to lead Doll and Jay somewhere, only to see Uzi, N, and V standing right behind them, ending the episode. A lot of people were excited for this episode because this was and is N's episode. He takes up the most screen time, and I'm delighted to say that he doesn't disappoint. What makes N so interesting to watch in this episode is that we get to see how he acts without factoring Uzi into all of his decisions. I said in Cabin Fever he was becoming an accessory to Uzi, and then this episode comes along where he doesn't even know who Uzi is throughout most of the episode, giving the viewers a chance to see N's pure, unfiltered personality. And what we get is a too pure for this world character who loves dogs, puts himself in harm's way for others, and is smart enough to avoid obvious danger, and just generally wants to make everyone happy in a way that doesn't make him feel like a yes man like he was in the pilot. This is N at his best, and just his personality alone was enough to elevate this episode up a tier in how enjoyable it was. Uzi, though, isn't as bad as I expected her to be with the crush arc she's going through. There are still moments where the crush is acknowledged, but instead of being sheepish and awkward, she has developed into a tsundere, which is a fitting advancement for the aggressive character we were introduced to in the pilot. Uzi never really shines in this episode, but her personality seems more consistent than ever before, which in my eyes is a net positive. Best Girl J truly returns in this episode, with her getting some proper screen time that is comparable to the amount she had in the pilot. Just like Uzi, her personality is consistent with her personality in episode 1, except for her being slightly less aggressive, which makes sense since she wasn't tasked with committing a genocide at this point in her life. But surprisingly, her personality isn't only consistent, but actually gets fleshed out more to reveal that she actually has the capacity to care about another person's well-being. Usually when writers try to humanize their villains later in the story, it feels forced, but thankfully this is not the case here, as we still do get to see her be unnecessarily aggressive towards N, and is unapologetic about it, but she has been given a friend to care for to reveal a more empathetic side to her character, similar to V and Lizzie. I will mention that unlike V and Lizzie, Jay feels more like an accessory to Tessa than her own character, since she really never does anything in this episode that doesn't revolve around Tessa. But Jay has always put her job before anything else, and if her job is to aid Tessa, then her doing that exceptionally well is in character for her. Speaking of Tessa, we finally get to see what kind of a character she is. And while N was consistently enjoyable to watch, Tessa ups the ante with her stealing all the attention in every single scene she's in. We don't learn too much about her, but we see her attention-deficient personality go through numerous situations that warrant a diverse number of emotions, be it joy, fear, anger, or determination. That makes a viewer feel like they have known this character since the pilot with how much she goes through in just one episode. She seems like a natural main character that seems even more believable and enjoyable to watch than Uzi at times. And what makes this even better is that this character's personality is kind of a small plot twist, with her initial introduction to the series showing her in a bad light, giving off the impression that she's a callous villain. Only then for this episode to reveal that she's a hyperactive teen who cares for N and J despite those two drones' personalities being the complete opposite of each other. Tessa is an absolutely endearing character, with the only problem I have with her being that she talks so fast with a heavy Australian accent that at times it can be hard to understand what she is even saying. Regardless, I can't wait to see more of her and to see if the modern version of her has changed since the Gala Massacre and the effects it had on her psyche, especially if she is as squeamish as our other newcomer Sin implied. Sin is another character who is a delight to watch. She may not steal the show as Tessa did, but she is just fascinating to observe, with her having to narrate all her actions and her neck never having enough strength to keep her head upright, so she constantly has to adjust it. She moves around like a broken doll and her face is always stuck in a smile. She is an unnerving character, sure, but maybe not quite as unnerving as Liam wanted her to be, and I think that is more due to her voice than anything else. I really like her voice, but hearing it come from a worker drone instead of the absolute solver is something that I never really got used to, and is almost distracting at times. I also think what makes her less intimidating than someone like Doll is that we see Doll gruesomely murder worker drones on screen and demonstrated her power on screen enough to show what a threat she is. Sin, on the other hand, does most of her dirty work off screen, and the implications of the things she has done is once again unnerving, but she just doesn't have that air to power that Doll had in episode 3, and like I said earlier, she is more fascinating to watch than intimidating. That only leaves us with V, who really is only present near the end of the episode since she was either shut off or possessed throughout the rest of it. There is one scene with her though that did something that I didn't expect to happen throughout the rest of the series, and that is acknowledging N and V's feelings for each other. It was short, with N just coming to V's side after she was possibly injured and V smiling at him and then them waking up and her blushing, But I was fully convinced the ship was dead, so congratulations to the N and V shippers. This episode's treatment of its characters was exemplary, with none of their actions or decisions feeling out of character, and oddly enough, every character acting more like they were in the pilot than ever before. N is arguably the best he's ever been, with no one overshadowing him and just letting him be himself. Uzi's not overly angsty, emotional, or aggressive at any point and finds the perfect balance between the three. Jay is not only consistent with the character traits that have been established, but she also expands on them. Tessa's personality is likable and entertaining enough to be main character status in every scene she's in. Sin is a mesmerizing addition to the cast who probably didn't leave the impression the creator intended, but still was always captivating to watch. And V's small amount of screen time is not wasted and progresses her dynamic with N. The representation of the cast is some of the best we have seen throughout the show, and under normal circumstances would have made this episode one of the show's best so far, if it wasn't for the fact that the impact of the on-point characterization is rivaled by the abysmal quality of the comedy. It's ironic that in my last video I defended Murder Drones for its comedy, rarely ever taking away from the show, only for this episode to do just that. As I mentioned in my last video, this show has the burden of trying to balance horror and comedy, which are the complete opposites on the spectrum of entertainment genres, and this episode not only is fantastically imbalanced in favor of humor, but isn't even that funny due to repetitive jokes, poor timing, and frequently undercutting tense moments. The hatch at the beginning of the episode, the crow scene, Uzi and N's reaction to V, Tessa's dad reacting to V and Jay fighting, N's reaction to seeing the basement, Tessa interrupting Sin's monologue, the Absolute Solver having trouble grabbing the scalpel, V having trouble grabbing the scalpel, and N's brief interaction with the Absolute Solver. All these moments are the same recycled joke where tension is built up only for the character to react in a way that kills the tension. That's 9 times that essentially the same joke is being told in a nearly 20-minute episode. That's almost the same joke being told once every 2 minutes. There are a handful of comedic moments I enjoyed, with all the best ones being visual gags, with us getting one of the best ones we've gotten in the whole series. And that scene with Jay breaking the chain I particularly enjoyed, even though I think most of the audience missed the joke because you either have to be well versed in corporate practices to understand the punchline, or due to Tessa's accent you can't even understand what she is even saying. But overall, there is no joke in this episode that justifies how badly they kill the tone of any moment that could have had an impact on not only the characters, but the viewer as well. I wish I could say that the jokes were the only things that had trouble regarding pacing, but that is about as far from the case as you can get. Murder Drones in general is a fast-paced show, but throughout this episode there are multiple scenes that felt dragged out, and others that go by so quickly that they never leave a strong impression on the viewer as they should. On subsequent watches, I always found myself skipping past the junkyard intro scene. I know it's important for lore, but it still felt a bit too long. I think if it was cut down by maybe 20 seconds by having the zombie drones tape skip more often so those that want to theorycraft can pause the episode, and those who want to just get into the episode don't have to wait as long to do so. I would say that the worst offender of a pause scene in this episode is when Uzi and N have to move V to get into the basement hatch. This scene should have been half as long as it was, and I know the reason for this scene being so dragged out is that it was supposed to be tense, but failed at doing so, making it instead feel like an odd moment that made me question if it was intentionally made to pad out their runtime. But you know what's worse than dragging out scenes that aren't very captivating? It's cutting scenes that are captivating too short. For example, the fight between V and Jay. I know this isn't an action series, but I can't be the only one who felt like the scene was cut way too short, especially since it was interrupted by an awkward, unfunny joke. Just at least 10 more seconds of well-choreographed blade-on-blade combat would have been much appreciated, especially since the fight scenes in the show can be pretty great, as we have seen back in the pilot episode. Another moment that I think is one of the biggest mistakes in the episode was the reveal of what was in the basement. I like that Murder Drones doesn't treat its audience like they are children. I think one of the best parts of the show is that it doesn't hold your hand and have to explain everything you're seeing to the viewer. But when Uzi and N enter the basement and see that it was either Sin or Tessa that turned N, V, and J into disassembly drones, it feels like what should have been one of the biggest reveals of the episode, but it's barely even acknowledged by the main duo. And to add insult to injury, N himself even shrugs it off as not that big of a deal for the sake of attempting to add another unfunny comedic moment. Just 10 to 20 more seconds of N and Uzi investigating the room, and Uzi saying something along the lines of, "You didn't deserve to have this happen to you, N. Not even V deserves this." Maybe J though. Would have been an exponential improvement to make this scene have an actual effect on the viewer. Lastly, I would like to discuss Sin's actual massacre at the gala. I don't necessarily think this scene is too fast-paced, but it would have been beneficial to have the actual massacre itself last 10 to 15 more seconds. Right as the massacre begins, we cut back to N's perspective, and while I do appreciate that we get to hear the muffled screams of the massacre, the scene would have been much more impactful if the perspective stayed in the gala in some way while the massacre happened. I know this show is meant for a younger audience, so I don't expect to see people being ripped apart, but something like Louisa being picked up by two of the Solver's claws and is about to be ripped in half as the camera cuts to Tessa as it focuses on her eyes as she watches in terror at the scene playing out in front of her, as the screams of the other guests being attacked by the possessed worker drones are heard loud and clear around her. But even though I have problems with those scenes, I would almost argue that they are balanced out by the handful of other scenes that are downright amazing. Doll's return in this episode was awesome, with no build-up or foreshadowing of her return whatsoever. I could easily argue that this is a flaw rather than something worth praising, but if you think about it, it does make sense. Doll can teleport wherever she wants, and she knows where Uzi lives, since she has visited her home in episode 3. And she would know that Uzi has the robo-bug since she was stalking her in episode 4. Her return was a complete surprise that immediately added some attention-grabbing moments into the episode that didn't take up enough time to feel like it distracted from the rest of the narrative. But Doll's scenes were nothing in comparison to these next two moments. The scene where we get to see Sin transform into her centipede form and leave to massacre the gala might be one of my favorite moments in the series. I stand by what I said earlier when I mentioned that Sin's voice isn't all that intimidating, but the way the lines are delivered in this scene nailed the combination of menacing and unsettling that I think Liam was originally going for. As for the lines themselves,
"You will not have to discard your pets, and I will not discard you. Best stay away from the gala, though. You seem squeamish."
well, I'm going to argue that this is one of the best threats I have heard in a show in a long time. Sin essentially declaring that she's the one in control was an impactful power play that, when combined with the score rapidly building up into a brief power outage synced with the sound of glass shattering as thunder is heard outside, culminates into captivating the feeling of danger and intensity perfectly. It could have stopped there, but was instead followed by a line that was masterful in its own right, with Sin insinuating what she was going to do in a way that almost feels simultaneously ruthless and empathetic, with the action she's going to commit never being directly said by her. But when she tells Tessa to stay away from the gala because she seems squeamish, that's when the horrific implications hit, but they are all delivered through Sin caring for Tessa's well-being. Everything that Sin says in this is threatening and horrifying, but it's all accompanied by her reassuring Tessa in a seemingly genuine way that I have no problem propagating as a quintessential example of complex and nuanced dialogue. And finally, the scene that I think everyone loved, the ending. The abrupt ending on a cliffhanger of everyone in the show suddenly being in the same place leaves a lasting impact on the viewer, which is exactly what this show needs more of. The cliffhanger in episode 3 was good, but this eclipses it completely. Not only is it probably one of the funniest parts of this episode with how quickly it cuts off the scene, but it also builds up a lot of hype for the next episode. I'll admit that I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about what kind of character interactions will result from this, with the possibilities being abundant. How will Uzi react to Jay being alive? How will Tessa react to seeing N again? And how will Doll react to seeing V? This is easily the best ending to any episode, and maybe even one of the best moments of the show, with how much it leaves a lasting impression on the viewer by making fantasizing about what could happen next near impossible to resist. We also finally get some payoff to some of the established mysteries. The reveal that Sin and the Absolute Solver are basically the same entity was my big "oh" moment. We get to learn what's on the zombie drone's tape, which didn't relate too much to the events within this episode, but can come into play in a big way in the future. It's also established that the Robobug is essentially a key, which wasn't too hard to deduce if you were one of the more keen-eyed viewers from the last episode. And finally, what should have been the biggest reveal is that Sin made the disassembly drones, which has so many implications that I could probably make a standalone video exploring that. All the reveals are pretty tame, with none of them being portrayed as a big deal, but were satisfying because the viewer's investment in the show feels like it's starting to pay off, and this episode didn't add that many mysteries outside of Doll's alliance with Tessa and Jay, so the feeling of the story progressing is more evident than ever. The reveals all fit neatly into the narrative, never feeling disruptive, for better or worse, but as for the narrative itself, it seems more confusing than usual. The entire premise is based around an Inception-style exploration of N's memories, but it becomes difficult to distinguish what is a part of the simulation and what actually happened. If we assume that everything up to the point of Uzi's intervention is what actually happened, then what happened to N in the swamp if Uzi wasn't there to save him? He obviously survived, but Tessa, Jay, and Sin were all chained up at this time, so how did he actually escape? Maybe he died there and Sin salvaged his corpse so she could turn him into a disassembly drone? Or did V save him? Speaking of which, where was V during this entire event? Was she already corrupted at this point and took part in the massacre since she would have had no reason to be guarding the basement hatch? It would have been really nice to see what V was actually like during this time of her life, but we didn't get to see any of that due to her being under Sin's control. Again, I like when the show doesn't spell everything out for us, but I think I would have preferred just an actual flashback to see exactly what happened instead of this corrupted dive into a simulation that resembles his memories. Also, this may be a nitpick, but if these are N's memories, then wouldn't that mean we shouldn't be seeing any scene following just Tessa and Jay or the Gala massacre because he wasn't there to witness those events? Anyways, I digress, but you know what makes this entire premise even more confusing than it needs to be is that once again we get a time skip that skips over the entire setup to the episode. From what we learned from Uzi is that they were trying to hack into N's memories, but he ended up shutting down when the Absolute Solver program intervened. I feel like this is a scene that absolutely should have been shown in some form. Imagine if the last episode ended on a cliffhanger where N and V suddenly just shut down, and we hear the Absolute Solver begin to speak from their bodies, saying something like, "I hope you enjoyed your time with them because it's time for me to reclaim my puppets." This would have built up so much more anticipation for this episode and set a contextual scene that would have made the premise of this episode feel less like it came out of nowhere. It would have also explained why V is under the Absolute Solver's control from the beginning of the episode, and why Uzi even had the idea to hack into their minds in the first place. Unfortunately, this isn't the only contextual scene that feels glossed over either. Remember that scene where N and Uzi have to move V to get the basement hatch that I criticized for being drawn out? Well, that scene was as long as it was because Liam wanted to build tension, but it ultimately didn't convey that feeling. The reason for this is because while a turned off V is unsettling, she doesn't seem dangerous. If we had a scene earlier where we see V killing a worker drone or stalking N from a distance, then that would establish that she's a threat. By doing this, when N and Uzi finally encounter her in her turned off state, the viewer would be tense because we would know that she's dangerous, and there's nothing we can do to stop our main duo from putting themselves into a dangerous situation. This is an advanced writing theory for horror. When we see a character swimming in an ocean in a shark movie, we get scared because exclusively the viewer knows that the character is in danger, while the character doesn't. No scene in this episode contextualizes the danger Uzi and N might be in during this scene, so the tension is reduced significantly, which is why this scene doesn't achieve its goal. It's almost baffling that this is the case because we see Liam Vickers do this very thing in a heartbeat with the scenes where the Absolute Solver kills off worker drones, building her up to be a threat, so that when Uzi and N finally encounter her, she is much more intimidating. But for some reason, when it comes to V in this episode, this setup wasn't repeated at all, making the purpose of the scene fall flat. I have seen others feel like this episode was underwhelming, and although I think I have stated more than enough reasons why this is, there is a more simple reason why this episode feels the way it does. This episode is supposed to be slow or intense with a lot of build up to a climactic moment. Every episode has done this in some way, with the pilot building up a fight between Uzi, N, V, and J, Heartbeat building up the confrontation with Absolute Solver, the Promenading building up Doll's master plan and the conflict that follows, and Cabin Fever building up Uzi's transformation. But what does this episode build up to? The Massacre Gala that the main characters aren't involved in and we barely get to see? The contents in the basement that are barely acknowledged? There's no climax to this episode, which I presume is the reason why so many people feel like this might be the most underwhelming one yet. We do get some payoffs here and there, but with Murder Drone's format of always building up to something, the fanbase is expecting a spectacle of some sort to make the wait feel like it has a payoff. But in this episode, the payoff feels more lackluster than ever before. I don't want to blatantly call this episode a mess, but it is sloppy. We get some of the highest highs in the series with the best characterization that we have seen for our cast, with them all feeling not only consistent but developed in a way that makes them better than ever before. And the episode contains some of my favorite scenes in the series. But then the sporadic pacing, the confusing narrative, the disruptive comedy, the poor delivery of certain scenes, and the absence of contextual scenes all drag this episode down towards the lower echelon of this show's overall quality. But despite everything I have said about this episode, I can't deny that I was still captivated by the unique setting and somewhat important story beats. And on top of that, throughout this show up to this point, the series has felt like it has been aimlessly wandering around mysteries and random events, and now with the introduction of Sin as a central antagonist and the tying up of loose plot points and exploration of backstory, the focus that this episode lacked might finally be fine-tuned enough for the coming episodes to have more of a direction to follow than ever before. I am worried that the next episode is going to be another time skip or open with a flashback, since a lot of shows that end on such a big cliffhanger often like to subvert expectations by having the following episode not follow in chronological order, and as we know with Liam, he really does not like being predictable with his writing. But either way, as long as the characters continue to stay as consistent as they were in this episode, the series might be more renowned for its characters than anything else. As for almost everything else in this episode, I hope Liam acknowledges any fan feedback because, from a writing standpoint, this episode is simply the worst.
I'm in danger!